No, so come on.
Okay. Good evening to all of our listeners, and welcome to tonight's episode of Theology on the Rocks. We ask that you bear with us for the next few episodes because we're kind of just getting this podcast going. We haven't even definitely decided on a name finally, so we're changing up the setting and the watering, and we'll progress as time goes on. We'll also be bringing out in due course a little bit more of an introductory video regarding Tristan and myself. So in case you were wondering, that is Tristan.
Yes.
And this is PJ. And to introduce ourselves a little bit more to you as well, so that we don't remain strange faces and distant voices. But then, without further ado, tonight's topic is going to be on the topic of suffering. So I can't recall now. Have we crossed it? Not yet. Theology on the Rocks. And with that, over to you. Not yet. First, to give some structure to this conversation, the idea is to roughly center our talk around three anchoring questions. The first being, what is suffering? The second, how do we suffer? And the third, how do we respond to suffering? We're not going to stick to these as though they were the law. Our conversation is going to ebb and flow. And this is probably going to be part of a multi-part series on the topic of suffering. So now, without further ado, to the first question. Tristan, how would you react if the terrifying question faces you? What is suffering?
So I've thought a lot about suffering, and I've come to the conclusion that I can't really think of a great definition of suffering. But I have thought there are ways of thinking about suffering. Suffering is definitely not something you can just superficially talk about. I also think it actually starts with your own experience. As soon as I hear the word suffering, I might actually think of what I've experienced already. So I would actually rather talk of different ways of suffering. There are levels of suffering. There are ways in which we maybe get harmed physically or spiritually even, or we have just a problem with our existence. These are for me big different experiences of suffering. But what has been your thought on suffering?
I'd first like to latch on to that point that you were making. I think you touch on a problem that we all face when dealing with these big theological issues. You know, we have to begin with the general somehow, because we're addressing universal topics that aren't just confined to our individual experiences of it. But at the end of the day, our firmest touchstone on experience with these topics is a very subjective individual one. I mean, I can't tell you what suffering is. I think that's why you avoided answering the question directly very wisely, because I don't think suffering exists for me. I see concrete instances of it. And from that, probably, my thoughts get shaped around the general idea, the general topic. So I completely agree with you, and then I will be quick to follow up on your leading us towards the second question. How do we suffer? We can perhaps even extrapolate this question to how does suffering look to you?
Yeah, so I would say suffering is something that ultimately, in its worst forms, is something that actually troubles your soul, or something deep in your existence, whether it's trauma, childhood experiences that we might not even remember, but that's actually somehow dragging us down. And I think that's one important form of suffering that we can't ignore. There's this inner child in us that experienced things when we were younger that's still affecting us now. And it's still actually causing us to suffer. It's causing us harm in some ways if we haven't dealt with our trauma as children. And then, of course, I think of suffering also when we suffer physically, when we get badly hurt, or when we have an illness or disease, or then also grief is one of the big ones as well. Is when we lose someone else, that is a big form of suffering, because it's almost like we lose some part of ourselves. Maybe you have more thoughts that I provoked.
You definitely provoke thoughts. You do that excellently. I was wondering now, and not to go off on a side trail here. We will get to the topic of anxiety. I know that is really one of your areas of, let's call it, expertise. But when you were mentioning this image of the child and the child's experience of suffering, I was immediately thinking of the image that you've shared in the past of our first meaningful experience in life being one of anxiety. When you're born, yes, and immediately you are removed from this safe place of care and nurture, and you're introduced into a terrible world of suffering, or a world that at first glance, and according to all of your faculties that are functioning right then and there, seems to be one filled with suffering.
Exactly.
And so perhaps we can elaborate on that topic. Perhaps that has provided you with some food for thought. Separation is something we as human beings have to deal with, and that's usually some kind of suffering that's attached, or some suffering that comes from separation. So being separated from your mother at birth is one of the terrible ones, and is maybe why we need a God the Father or God the Mother who accepts us, almost like we are creeping back into our mother's wombs. That is a way that our mentor sometimes explained faith to us, is actually just climbing back into the mother's womb, sort of trusting again like a child, like a baby in God. Sorry, that was a tangent. No, it's a
but
good
I
tangent.
wanted to say, separation. Basically, that is also one way to describe suffering. I've heard is when parts of yourself are actually disconnected. So you might be disconnected from the person next to you, but there are also parts within yourself that are disconnected. Like there might be memories that or experiences that you have in your past that are very difficult to think about, and that cause a lot of anger or sadness or resentment. And then you might have another side that's basically trying to stay positive, to
deal with it.
Stay on the light side of life, or the bright side of life, that kind of thing. But without getting too much into psychology, maybe you can offer some better theological thoughts.
No, I like the trend that neither of our first languages is English, so I want to say the trend, which is like the what is a trend?
Trend. What?
Yeah, the trend that you're on right now.
Yeah.
In any case, the idea of separation I find to be one that really strikes me just here and now. And I can't remember why it strikes me just here and now.
Yeah, that's fine. Well, I mean, I immediately think of the book that I still have to read.
I often think of that book as well.
I am at chapter 3 now. The last time we spoke, I was at chapter 2.
They're very short chapters.
Yeah. Where there's a lot of suffering. And the author is a great writer who writes about faith in times of suffering, basically. Maybe you could share something about that wonderful book you read.
Yes.
And you're allowed to give away some of the parts of the stories.
I will not. I will not, because that's going to allow you to skip another chapter. But perhaps on that note, you know, what struck me, we'll return to this question of separation again. There was something there that I'll be touching upon. It's rather late. And suffice to say, this isn't our first whiskey of the night.
Ons my idea.
Ons lost the idea. In any case, we shall continue. On this note of really looking at suffering, I think perhaps our impulse to abstract it or to make it an idea that we can write down our thoughts upon is a way of escaping it. Is a way of not confronting it. Because as you were elaborating on all these various forms of separation and all of the difficult emotions that accompany it, we'll get back to that tangent in a bit. The separation thought just came back to me. Perhaps one could start to think about suffering as a separation from, the necessary comforts of life. Comforts not in the sense of extraneous things, but emotional stability, loving relationships, safety,
chaos,
health, etc. To be separated from these good things is to be suffering. One is deprived of the good in some sense.
Great disorder.
Yes. And now to get back to our not running away from them, but our real facing them. I watched a movie on a flight just the other day. It's an interesting movie. It's Freud's Last Session, about a fictional conversation between Sigmund Freud and C.S. Lewis. And in this movie, there's this incredibly striking moment when the character of Freud looks Lewis dead in the eyes and he says, "There is so much pain and suffering in this world." And as he says it, you can't escape the fact that he is speaking the gospel truth. I mean, to abstract it and to make it some concept that we want to comment upon is to run away from those extremely difficult and real instances of suffering that we too have encountered and that we try and shy away from.
Exactly. And that is something that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for example, one of the great theologians of the 20th century, wrote about a lot, is actually how we deal with escapism in Christianity. How we might sometimes think faith is an escape from suffering, but he would say it's actually something that propels you to participate in suffering, not just for the sake of suffering, but suffering for others and suffering with others. And he did that in practice. That was a big thing, that it's not just something abstract or a theory, but that he really, of course, decided to protest against Hitler, and he was sent to prison, and a big story. But in any case, I also wanted to say, this way of abstracting suffering is something that I think we Christians have to deal with. Is actually, how can we practice our faith really when suffering gets so hard? And it's not an easy question. It's not like saying we have to do this better, or like here are the steps 1, 2, 3. But
because that itself would be an abstraction.
Exactly. And I mean, we see this in the Bible, of course. When you talk about what's the best thing to do in life, like in Proverbs, there are many very wise sayings and great sayings that can inspire you. But when these sayings then come into question in the real troubles of life, like in the story of Job, then suddenly it becomes different. And we were actually just talking earlier and saying, as people who studied theology just a year ago, we're suddenly finding out now, as young pastors, that in practice, suffering is a very different concept than when you theorize about it.
Definitely, I concur wholeheartedly. And as you were mentioning this, various instances of contact with suffering flow through my memories and through my thoughts, and immediately I'm struck by the discomfort of it. You know, I very strongly think that this impulse in theology, which tries to provide a shallow version of the Christian faith, which is all about pleasure and enjoyment, is an abomination. It might be strongly stated, but it does not accompany us into the depths of reality. It does not follow us into places where life gets real and terrible and terrifying. And I strongly think that if we avoid the realities of suffering in our theologies, and I think if we avoid the really terrible, seemingly unintelligible instances of suffering in our theology, then we end up at the foot of the cross and find ourselves flabbergasted by this incredible instance of suffering, which somehow stands at the center of this Christian faith, but which our feel-good, look-good theology just can't make any sense of, or can't find a place for, is probably the best way to put it.
Yeah. I mean, that is the point that I came to as well, actually, through my thinking, is at some point, maybe not being able to describe or define suffering is also the same experience I have when you try to define what happened on the cross. It's something indescribable in the end. You can't fully put it in words. That's why we also preach about it every Sunday, perhaps, because it's something you have to talk about over and over again, and it's not exhaustive. You'll never talk about it enough, because suffering at its deepest or worst level is really something you can't always put into words. And I think that's maybe also, I think, would be a proper response to some superficial answers and questions and movements, is there are some deep questions or experiences in life that you can't just have a quick answer for. Sorry, I'm talking
This
a
is
lot
one of
now.
them. No, please.
But the last point for me is I've been watching some debates between atheists and Christians, but where the atheists actually make some really good points. But then I realize it's all well and good to talk about things superficially and debate them rationally, but then when these experiences happen, like someone loses someone, and they actually start questioning God, and even they might not even really be very faithful or anything, but suddenly they wonder, how could a creator let this happen? Or how, that kind of thing you can't just talk about in a debate. It has to be expressed differently, and maybe through art or music or something like that.
Excellent. Yeah, I can't wait for you to get to that chapter in Dostoevsky, which so eloquently echoes what you've been alluding to here now, but you definitely touch upon it in the same manner that Dostoevsky does, and I think one of the reasons for it is that there is something to the second question about how do we suffer that we all can answer. Some, perhaps more elaborately than others, some with a great deal more anguish than others, some perhaps even more honestly than others. But all of us suffer, and I really do think that all of us suffer terribly sometimes.
Yeah.
I don't think any of us are really completely spared from absurd suffering, or suffering that seems absurd. And perhaps we want to shy away from that rather quickly, but I allude back to your statement upon the cross, that looking at this, I want to use a big word which I don't fully understand, archetypal instance of suffering, we look at it and we're struck by the utter absurdity of it. And I think therein lies one hell of a lot of comfort for us going through our little absurd sufferings. The knowledge that God himself, who is, who was, who suffered amongst us, knows very deeply something of what we are going through. But maybe we're putting the cart in front of the horses by jumping rather liberally between these second and third questions. I think that we can devote a whole further session to the topic of how do we deal with suffering.
Exactly.
Perhaps, unless there was a thought that you immediately want to run with, you could elaborate on some of the biblical examples, because they're everywhere, of suffering that might teach us something about, or that might not teach us, but show us something of how we suffer.
Exactly. So one of our last questions was actually, how do we respond to suffering? And with faith, probably. and I think a wonderful way of thinking about that is obviously looking at the passages in the Bible. And I looked at some of them again and thought of the psalm, or the psalmists, or David complaining to God, lamenting, showing a big mix of emotions, actually. Many of the psalms start off maybe with crying, like Psalm 6, like, why do you let me weep on my bed every night? Or but they end with a glorification of God, or worshipping God. There are psalms there's that one Psalm 88 where it's
my
all
favorite,
just dreadful. And then you get other psalms where it's a lot of praise, and in spite of what I've experienced, the psalmist might say, stuff like that. And that's one way of dealing with it, is actually, I think, complaining to God, lamenting to God, writing to him, talking about it, not just because you have to, but because you're actually deeply expressing something that's happening to yourself or within yourself. And then you also get the story of Job, we already mentioned, and then I often think of the Gospel of Mark. Now, all the Gospels have stories of suffering, or there's of course the Passion of Christ and John and so on, but my immediate thought of suffering is often linked to the Gospel of Mark, because this Gospel was actually written to people in Rome, or Christians, who were suffering terribly, like you can't imagine. You know, there were many of the people they knew were being burnt at the stake. The emperor was totally against them, Emperor Nero, and it was really just a gruesome time for many Christians in Rome. And this gospel doesn't give a very easy answer. It actually gives you a very concrete, complex, and very real story and picture of how Jesus Christ suffered with his disciples. The emotions that's part of this adventure, the difficulty with politics and so on. But in the end, how this suffering Christ, or this supposed king on the cross, then is constantly called King of the Jews 4 times in the last chapter of Mark, and this guy is actually, or this suffering servant, this suffering king, which is an ironic statement, is in the end our Savior, which is actually where the gospel tradition, the gospel actually ends. There's the next part where he is raised to life, but it's actually that one where he's crucified is where you're left with this big question, or wondering, wow, was this now really the Christ, the Savior of the world? Yeah.
Do I trust in this?
Yeah. And I mean, I can
excellent.
mention many other passages, but that's what came to my mind.
I think one thing that you've started with now, perhaps we can elaborate on it a little bit. I have no idea how long we've been going on.
I don't know. Yeah, I've been having fun.
As have I.
Okay. Yeah, I've been getting a lot of.
No, please. I think it's been a very good exchange. But now that you've been going through these images, one thing struck me. And again, this is something that okay, perhaps to share a little bit more concretely, I think, thinking back to the psalmist now, oscillating between these instances of terrible lament in the face of suffering and then praise in the face of God's goodness and deliverance. That dynamic is something which reminds me very strongly of my young life as a Christian, my young life as a believer, as an early teenager. When I was still a child, and as a child, I think, and the psychologist might tell me I'm completely wrong here, but a little bit more in touch with my emotions, meaning not constantly trying to suppress them or trying to order them, but just, having everything flow forth. When I look at that time, I can associate rather strongly with these movements of the psalmist, these irrational jumps between anger and praise, frustration and hope, etc. I must admit, as I've grown older, and I'm still fairly young, but at this stage in life, I must say that the images of Job and of the psalmist in Psalm 88 strike me a little bit more forcefully for the fact that this oscillation has died down, and perhaps it's due to my own trying to keep everything more ordered than it is.
We try and keep things controlled.
Yes, but those expressions of real lack of satisfaction with suffering that you just can't straighten out. You just can't get to grips with it. And it's not as though you can escape it either. I mean, you sit and perhaps I'm going to escape the endless avenue in which that might have gone down. Once I was confronted by a young lady who was subject to terrible suffering because of a brain tumor that she was having to deal with at the age of 16. And I remember when confronting my pastor, an excellent pastor, with the question of how does she deal with this? Or what do I say to her in the midst of this suffering? He gave quite a long dramatic silence, and then he said, well, you know what? I'm not trying to avoid the question here, but I think regardless of what you say to her, and regardless of how accurately and helpfully you explain the situation to her, at the end of the day, she still has to deal with having the brain tumor. And his implication was that suffering is not so much a thing to understand and to hash out and to solve, as much as it is something to go through, to deal with, to live with. But this is actually, again, moving into our third question.
Oh, that's great. And I think maybe we could even move towards the end now, because that's probably our next part is in the next video we actually want to talk about how the theology of the cross, actually, which is a lot about suffering, but exactly goes down this route of you can't really just understand it, you have to go through it, and as a Christian especially, following Christ by carrying your own cross, that's a big task as a Christian, and that's what we're going to discuss under the theme of theology of the cross, which is very Lutheran. And but maybe just to end off, just to conclude, suffering is difficult to define, difficult to put into words. It's difficult to control ourselves when we suffer. It's like we realize we're not that in control, and sometimes we just have to go through it, and we can't just understand it rationally. And what else was there?
I think that one point that I would like to add on here that we can perhaps take up in the next session when we begin is to pause a little bit more uncomfortably with these images of suffering. To not just refer to them abstractly or in general terms, but to really look at striking images of suffering, because I think those do bring us to a pause where we can't find easy avenues. and I think that's very much in line with, or exemplified in the theology of the cross. And then the final thing that I'd like to say is that, just like a little, what do you call it, enticement, the next session will be coming to you either from the deep interior of the northernmost recesses of Botswana in the wilderness, where we will be on safari from tomorrow, or from the vast plains of the Makgalagadi salt pans under the vast expanse of the universe. That sounds rather postmodern to talk about the universe at the end of the... I pass to you. I pass to you.
No, exactly. There's a lot more to come, and yeah, like we said, we're still figuring this out a little bit, but we're having a lot of fun doing it, and again, I like just leaving a disclaimer. We might not say everything perfectly here, and if we had to write an article about this or an academic article, it might be a bit different. It's not that easy to get your precise, accurate thoughts just like that, speaking about it. It's something we still have to learn. But we hope we at least challenged you a little bit to think about this more. Maybe you have some easy answers or easy questions. You can write them in the comments. That's fine. And yeah, please, if you found this in any way useful or interesting, please like the video and maybe share it if it's worth it. But yeah, we want this basically just to be helpful.
I think what they always
Not
say
in it
is
for the views.
like and subscribe is, I think, the thing we're supposed to say to them.
Like, comment, and subscribe.
There we go. Dit was uit.